Okay, this presentation is about design at war, specifically about war posters and propaganda. And as we're looking at things, keep in mind these misconceptions that people often have about propaganda, probably myself included. We notice propaganda when we can clearly recognize something as a lie, but we don't always recognize it if it's saying something true but motivating. We recognize propaganda when it comes from the other side. We tend to use the word propaganda in a derogatory sense. If it's from our side, it's patriotic. If it's their side, it's propaganda. So, but propaganda really is any information that's done, especially by a government, designed to persuade people to action. Another misconception is that it's never useful. I think we could think of times when getting people to do something in the public interest. You might think of public service announcements that tell people to quit smoking, for example. That's an example of propaganda that is bent on a useful purpose. And also that propaganda is only used by government. We'll see in these slides that other entities also publish propaganda. And really, if you think about, maybe you could even broaden out your definition that any kind of design that's attempting to influence someone's mindset or get them to believe something, whether it's true or not, is propaganda. When we analyze propaganda, we want to think about who it's targeting, just like any other piece of communication. Who is this designed to speak to? Where did it come from? Who created it? Is it from a government organization? Is it from an individual? Is it from a company? Is it from, some other entity? What was it for? What's its intended purpose? What tools were used to reach that goal? So when you analyze both the content and the form, what is the message and how are they depicting this message? What are the graphic tools, especially as designers? What was happening at that point in the war when we look at these war pieces? You can see, I think, an increasing kind of desperation as both sides got closer to the end of the war. The messages get more extreme and kind of more hysterical. And in the end, was it effective in accomplishing its goal? And, maybe you think about, was it effective and which side won? Did it win because it had better propaganda? Or maybe which side was able to motivate people to do things that they wouldn't have normally done. So thinking about the effectiveness of the propaganda is not necessarily the purposes that it was intended for, but how well did it work, I guess. Okay, so design as propaganda, it's kind of intimidating to think about, but it's true that propaganda was one of the primary purposes of 20th century graphic design. So the first really half of the 20th century, from 1918 to 1945, I guess it's like 30 years something, was spent at war, and an enormous amount of public resources were devoted to those wars, including the resources of artists and designers. We talked in the last lecture, in the poster lecture, kind of the commercial business of posters was just getting ramped up, and then suddenly all of that energy and creativity was halted and devoted to war purposes. So other than propaganda during both of these world wars, there was not a huge amount of commercial activity in terms of graphic design. I mean, things were still going on in the background, but an enormous amount of the talent and resources of the population was devoted to the war. And that's especially true with regard to poster design. Although that's what we're focusing on in this lecture, there are, of course, many other mediums of propaganda. And at that time, during these wars, there was also newspapers, magazines, and books were devoted to carrying the messages of both the government and also interested other groups. Stephen Heller talks about in his presentation, which is amazing, the importance of collectible memorabilia, of manufactured objects, and to spread the message, especially of authoritarian governments or totalitarian governments, to get people to buy these little trinkets and souvenirs. Architecture and sculpture, from just something as simple as the design of a rally event to monumental sculpture that was meant to be permanent. Both music and poetry. The composer Wagner is unfortunately very associated now with World War II Germany. Although he was a genius of a composer, there's a little bit of taint of his talent because it was done in the service of Nazi Germany. And also, of course, theater spectacles, and by that I mean sort of big public events and rallies. So performance art was used in purposes of propaganda, as well, of course, as movies, newsreels, and radio. Newsreels, if you don't know what they are, were short little spots that ran before the feature presentation in theaters, and that was new as of the Second World War. During World War I, radio was just getting started and other electronic media. Obviously, there was no television in either war, but movies, people would go to the movies on Saturday afternoon and see the newsreels before the big feature. So what were the purposes of propaganda and visual persuasion during these wars? Armies had to be recruited, so getting people, there was not a draft at first anyway. We had volunteer armies in many of the different countries, so just persuading people to join, persuading people to keep their chins up and to, be optimistic and not to give up the fight, to raise money. It was the expensive technology that was being made, planes, zeppelins, tanks, machine guns, so the government needed to fund all of that production through different means, including war bonds, which is basically the government selling a bond so people could buy them and then, cash them in later, but it was, handing over some temporary money to the government so that they could use it to invest in production. There's support for conservation, so conserving things like metals and rubber and even food, basic natural resources to be able to use for the army, so getting people on board with that kind of conservation effort, and also just changing people's mind, really to get people to think about the danger of the enemy, so whipping up, in some cases, hate or fear about the enemy and the impending danger of its threat to civilization of the war itself was a primary purpose of propaganda. Nothing new there. So, covering specifically the period of the two world wars, I'm sorry, that should say 1914. So 1914 is the beginning of the First World War, and 1945 is the end of the Second World War. And at first, we're just going to look at World War I. This was really a terrible, bloody, and traumatizing war. It was a global war that was centered in Europe, so many of the battlefields were in the European theater, but there were, of course, essential battles carried out in different areas as well, including the Middle East. And it lasted from 1914 to 1918, 4 years. Pitted the Allied powers, which was the United Kingdom, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, with France and Russia and the United States, are all together the Allies. And then the Central Powers was Germany, Austro-Hungary, and also the Ottoman Empire, which seems like something from, prehistory, but it was still existed at the beginning of the war. And in fact, the little area, hotbed of Bosnia-Herzegovina is where the initial sort of tinderbox was started with the assassination of Grand Duke Ferdinand that set off a series of events cascaded to cause the beginning of the war. So that was parts of Turkey, Armenia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Greece, Egypt, Yemen, and Iraq. And then also Italy was part of the Central Powers. We've got two opposing styles of graphic design, which is interesting, and that was an outgrowth of where the aesthetic was at the beginning of the war, after that poster era that we talked about last week. So the posters produced by the Central Powers were radically different from those made by the Allies. In some ways, the Central Powers, being as they were centered around some powerhouse designers in Germany, were perhaps a little bit more modern, and the work by the Allies was centered in a more illustrative style, golden age of illustration kind of era, especially on the American side. When we compare the strategies and techniques of the Central Powers graphic design versus the Allies, on the Central Power side, we have a simpler style, thinking about Lucian, Bernhard, those Plakatstil posters, like the Priester Matches poster. So choosing one image and making it a symbol, or really simplifying things down to the most graphic image possible. Words and images were often integrated. The communication was conveyed by simplifying images into powerful shapes and patterns or symbols, and showing the destruction of the enemy not in a human form, but as a destruction of a symbol or a flag. On the Allied side, we have a more illustrative approach, using literal rather than symbolic imagery, and both British and American posters sort of tugged on emotional heartstrings and talked about protecting traditional values of home and family. In the United States, there was an emphasis on making the world safe for democracy. World War I was called the war to end all wars. Unfortunately, that did not pan out to be true, but that was the idea. And we also have this kind of emotional, again, appeal of children, oftentimes, weighing in with their needs or opinions. Okay, so looking at the Allied powers, again, that's the France, Russia, Great Britain, United States side, starting off with this poster that was produced by the French, begging for British troops to come over and fight on the battlefields of France. And the war, started again in this little pocket in Bosnia-Herzegovina, but quickly expanded and multiplied all across all across Europe. France got dragged in relatively early before the United Kingdom did, and there's a little sense of ominous, closeness. If you look in the map in the background, you can see how close together England and France are at that little narrow point of the English Channel. And so not only was it a literal depiction of like, come on over, guys, come, we need you, help, help. It's also like, hello, we're right over here. It's a little bit close. Anything that happens to us is going to affect you, so you better hurry up, get in there now. One of the most famous images, of course, you'll recognize the composition, was created in 1915 as a poster for military recruiting by the British. The designer was Alfred Leet, and the figure there is Lord Kitchener. So he, again, was an actual literal person that would have been recognizable at the time with his distinctive mustache. So he's personally making an appeal, join the army. God Save the King on there. And another personal appeal, this is again, very emotional propaganda poster urging British people to remember Edith Cavell, who was a British nurse who was part of the Red Cross and so treated soldiers from both sides. She helped 200 soldiers escape from German-occupied Belgium, and then was accused of treason, found guilty, and was shot by a German firing squad. And so she was really made into a martyr figure to whip up fear and hatred of the Germans. And you can see here this German officer, there's a little bit of smoke still disappearing from his gun. It's a pretty, graphic illustration. You don't see any blood on her, but she's definitely portrayed as, a heroic sort of glowing angel. And if you look in the background, it's interesting. The German troops there are all looking aside. They can't even bear to bring themselves to look at her. Again, she did help treat German soldiers as well as English soldiers. So her death was widely publicized by the British War Propaganda Bureau. Another piece from the British War Propaganda Bureau, there's a little boy on the floor. Notice that he's playing with tin soldiers, and this is, sort of a futuristic vision of after the Great War. What will your kids say if you didn't participate, if you sat this one out? Again, at this time it was a volunteer army, so you could sign up, and there was, social pressure to participate somehow in the war effort. On the U.S. side, stealing a little bit of the magic of that poster by Alfred Leet, but this one, of course, became much more famous. This was a poster for recruiting in 1917. It was one of the most widely produced posters in history, with over 5 million copies made at the time. And what happened here is we turned the literal figure of Lord Kitchener, the Minister of War, into a symbolic figure of the nation, Uncle Sam. And Uncle Sam was an invention of James Montgomery Flagg, of the illustrator. Flagg was a famous editorial illustrator, worked for a lot of the big magazines. He was kind of a rock star of illustration at the time, and he probably did the lettering himself. So you can see sometimes in these posters it's a little bit awkward as illustrators learned how to integrate lettering with their images. This one's pretty successful, though. Another famous illustrator of the era, Joseph Leyendecker, who actually went on to be really successful in the period after the war, during the 1920s. This was it looks like a cover of the Saturday Evening Post, and you can see his elaborate signature down in the lower right. I like it. It's like it's got all kinds of swashes and doohickeys on it. You could buy war bonds through the Boy Scouts. They would happily sell them to you. This is the third Liberty Loan campaign, so the third time they're coming at you to try to buy war bonds. And again, using both literal images of, an actual boy, but also the symbol of, American justice, I guess, Lady Liberty. And she's taking the Be Prepared sword from the Boy Scout. One of my absolute darling heroes is Jessie Willcox Smith. She was an American from Pennsylvania, actually. This is a poster for the American Red Cross in 1918, and I like the curiously British structure of the sentence. Have you a Red Cross service flag? You can see, have you a Red Cross service flag? It sounds very British to me. Again, emphasizing the public's contribution, appealing to your patriotism and to your, the love of your children, clearly a holiday effort. And the deal with the Red Cross is if you contributed to the Red Cross, you would get a flag and you could put it in your window. So it was that social pressure of propaganda of saying, I participated, did you? So if you were the only person on your block that did not have a Red Cross service flag in your window, I think that you would be seen as a little unpatriotic at best, and possibly a spy or a traitor at worst. Jessie Willcox Smith, here she is. She was from Mount Airy, Pennsylvania, born there in 1863, studied at Moore College of Art, which of course still exists in Philly. She had a very successful career in magazine and book illustration. There's some of her covers, and did specialize in mothers and children. Love this image. It cracks me up. It's a British poster, and I think that you can see the relationship to some of those beggar staff works, and with the graphic, play between the foreground and the background, and the positive and negative space, and the simplicity of the image, and just making this chicken into a war hero is kind of just cracks me up. It's got a little symbol of the English crown on him. It's a royally, endorsed chicken. And this poor chicken has to be a soldier for the duration of the war, laying eggs for the wounded. I don't know how wounded people needed more eggs, maybe just to bring them back up to full strength, or maybe it was because eggs were used in vaccines or something. I don't know. But anyway, they needed their eggs. This one also cracks me up. This is a World War I recruitment poster from the French Ministry of War. Very dynamic illustration in the background by Roger de Valerio, and the breakdown of the imagery into 4 colors, I guess. Very strong composition, and this soldier is absolutely riding that tank like it was a wild bucking bronco in a rodeo show. So I don't think that tanks actually really do that in real life. I don't think you can make a tank pop a wheelie like that, but it kind of looks fun, so I don't know, whatever gets the boys to sign up. So this is an interesting piece. It's an editorial illustration, so not technically a poster, but just expressing the mood of the time, and also with this kind of interesting portrayal of what the two sides are doing during World War I. So the fellow in the middle with his little shiny hat and cape is representing France, and on the right we have the Central Powers, Germany and Austro-Hungary. And on the left, we've got the Allied folks. I don't know who that little guy with the little bellhop hat is supposed to represent, but clearly we've got Mr. American Capitalist, the guy with the top hat. We've got the skinny British imperialist guy with the big mustache. We've got I think that's I don't know if that's a French cavalry guy down on the ground in front. And we've got a Russian and a Turkish and some other dudes in the back. Anyway, those people on the left, do not look particularly strong. I think we can agree. They're sort of a ragtag band of either misfit sort of old people and skinny people that don't look very strong, whereas the two fit, military guys on the right look like they could just give one strong yank on that rope and everybody would topple over. And underneath it says European equilibrium in 1914. France caught in the middle, and I think that you can get this sort of sense of threat of these armies over here are pretty well equipped, and I'm not sure we're actually up to it. So I guess if that's motivating, help us out here a little, okay? All right, let's take a look at the Central Powers, those guys on the right, Austria, Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire. This is a poster to raise money in war bonds, and I think right away the alarm bells in your head should go off and say, or the graphic design recognition bells should say, Art Nouveau. Right? This is 1914 or so, and not too long after that Art Nouveau movement, which was really the last century. That was like 1880s. So we've got this elegant young lady and a big bowl of coins. She's trying to raise money for the German bank, and or probably more like Austrian. It feels like Vienna secession. Whereas this German poster, same war drive, so this is where we can really see that shift in styles and this modern idea of Plakatstil, of a single focused graphic symbol. And to us, this might not mean very much. We've got this green, dragony kind of dude in the background who's dripping blood from his teeth, and the giant number 8 that's strangling him, and then 8 arrows that are piercing his skin. The artist signs it, Julius Klinger, down below. And this is, again, a poster for the 8th War Drive in 1917. So the red figure 8 is a trap for the Allies, strangling them there. I don't think that, I keep trying to read if there's like supposed to be a shape of that dragon. Like, is that a country or a river or something? I don't think it is. I think it's just purely a symbol of the opposite side. This Lucian Bernhard, this is an earlier war loan campaign from 1915. If you remember Lucian Bernhard, see his little square signature down at the bottom. He's the guy that did the Priester Matches poster. So this looks old-fashioned, and it intentionally so. He's harking back to sort of the glory of the Middle Ages in Germany, and it's even a little bit of a reminder, like, hey, we were a military might back then in the days of knights and, warring guys with suits of armor on. And the lettering is what we would call fracter or black letter or German letter. This became a symbol of Germanness. Hitler made it a mandatory sort of type style. There was very specific specifications during World War II about the traditional German lettering, and of course this comes from medieval manuscripts that were hand lettered, and then the early printed books in Canabula with our friend Gutenberg Bible was done in this kind of style too. So it's really harking back to this medieval era. And also, not to inject myself in it, but I always like to put personal connections. So my father was a World War II vet. He was a naval aviator and flew airplanes in the South Pacific. And he, I believe, was very traumatized by the war and had PTSD. He did not talk about it at all, except that he was very racist, both about Japanese people and about German people. So there was an anti-German sentiment in my home growing up in Indiana, which is sort of, I think, kind of seems very old-fashioned now. But in fact, when I went to get married, when I met my husband, whose name is Dane Burkhardt, who is a Pennsylvania German from a family that's been here for 300 years, probably just as long as my family was in Indiana. But my parents were still very suspicious of him because he had a German background and a German name. So anyhow, that has translated into me. Whenever I see this kind of typeface, it kind of gives me a little bit of the willies. I still associate it with like Nazi and Hitler and World War II. And so I know that it's a very trendy sort of type style designed for things like tattoos. But I think it goes back, there's this lineage that goes back to the meaning of World War II, and then before that to a even more ancient meaning. And sometimes, it's seen as being like a religious, Gothic script, but it gives me the willies. That's all I can say. Okay, Julius Gipken's central powers, and here again you've got this extremely modern, stripped down symbol of the German eagle, which is the representation of the German country, and the Air Force in particular, sitting on top of the roundel. I believe that's the French roundel, which is the symbol that was on the aircraft, sides of aircraft, that's been shot up by bullets. So it's a very sort of non-emotional, it's very symbolic. It's the symbol of Germany and the symbol of the Allies, and rousing patriotic feelings in you. But what I think it cracks me up is that the image is so modern, and then you've got, again, this like vintagey looking, like medieval looking writing where you would think it would have sans serif type like this one. This is 1916. The artist is Hans-Rudi Erdt, who is, again, a modern Plakat designer. And, as we look at these works, I have split feelings about them. I look at this and I think, this is a beautiful poster. I could totally see putting that on my wall. There's something just like so pleasing about the color palette and the way the U has become the little window that he's looking through the controls of a periscope. That's the little thing that sticks up on a submarine. The U-boats were German submarines. Wonderful movie called Das Boot, which anyone should see if they're interested at all in military suspense movies and claustrophobia movies. Super scary. But anyway, this German U-boat captain, or whatever they're called, commander, I guess, has sunk a British or American ship with his torpedo, and he's being glorified in this poster. It was a huge military force. The German submarines were like the stealth force that it took us a while to catch up with the American submarines, and they really were doing huge amounts of damage to the British Navy at the beginning of the war. Anyway, you can look at it as a beautiful piece of artwork, even though it was for the other side. This also has become... You'll see the way that this poster has had repercussions down the line. In this image, it is a group of, basically it looks like peasants holding up, or just like working people holding up a soldier who's pulling down this British flag. And it's interesting how the flag has formed the shape of a heart, and the heart is being ripped. And even though the colors are a little shifted, so it's supposed to be the British flag, but it's gone green on us. But it's definitely talking about defeating England. It's another poster for a war loan campaign. And that same kind of idea has been echoed and reversed in 1920. Is that right? The war loan campaign by the German poster artist. And then in 1945, we have this iconic photograph of soldiers raising the American flag on the island of Iwo Jima in the Second World War. And then in 2001, the flag being raised from the ruins of the World Trade Center after the 9/11 bombing. Okay, the Maverick from Munich. We spoke about Ludwig Hohlwein in the Plakat lecture. He was a leading German poster designer. His work straddled the line. He made use of sort of the best of the symbolic style of the central powers, of the sort of stripped down symbols with more literal figures of the pictorial style of the Allies. And that's probably because he was this masterful poster designer before the war began and was engaged in doing things both before and after the war. This is after World War I, in the period between the wars, doing an ad for Mercedes, which is, of course, a German brand. There was a rise of German industry after World War I that provided a bunch of clients for him, including Audi and BMW and Mercedes-Benz, Lufthansa, a lot of brands that are still around today. And he worked in the United States for Camel and Fatima cigarettes. So he managed to make it through the war and still work for international clients. This is his poster from World War I, 1914. Again, masterpiece of poster design, I would say. The way that the 3 legs of the Red Cross are there, and we supply the 4th leg, which would be covered up by the soldier standing in front of it. But we still sort of see that Red Cross, and the way that he's used the background color of white to suggest the soldier's white trousers, and also the white bandage, and then the little red echo as the band around his head and his red insignia on his shoulder. So this is a plea to donate to the Red Cross, and just a beautiful and emotional. You look at the suffering on the face of the soldier, and you can feel his pain. All right, so that's leading us into World War II. I'm skipping over the period between the wars, which is interesting graphically too, and we'll be talking about that in upcoming lectures. But in between, roughly, what happened was, I'm sure that you are familiar with the Roaring 20s after 1918, the end of the First World War, the gradual elimination or passing of the pandemic, the Spanish flu. That was 1918 and 1919, and then after that, the economy came roaring back in the United States and elsewhere in Europe. Not so much in Germany; it took a little bit, but so there was a boom time, then followed quickly by a bust in 1929. The Great Depression in the United States was also affected, or multiplied, I guess, reflecting a global depression at the same time. So not only the United States was plunged into a state of depression and poverty, there was a huge inflation in German currency before the depression, and then a plunge in the value of money, and people were starving in the streets. It was a very bad time, and out of that rose, especially in Germany, a resentment to the victors of the First World War and a rebirth of this German nationalist movement that resulted in the rise of Hitler, and the rest, is history. So speaking of Hitler, he had an unsuccessful attempt to seize power in 1923, relatively soon after the war, and then was sent to prison. Wrote a book called Mein Kampf that was his autobiography, which set his philosophy and his ambitions for Germany. And he had a talent for not only visual propaganda, but also verbal and auditory propaganda. He was a very persuasive speaker. So the combination of those two things, of being very aware of the power of visual mediums and also very aware of the power of words and language. Of course, you probably have heard the apocryphal tale. He was he was not admitted to art school, so apparently had a resentment against artists, but definitely understood the power of art, and also in the end became kind of resistant to any movements of modernity, which he saw as degenerate. So Joseph Goebbels, who was the Minister of Propaganda for the National Socialist regime for Hitler's party, is quoted as saying, "Is propaganda as we understand it not also a form of art?" And I think that clearly it is. So the combination of Hohlwein, of Ludwig Hohlwein, the poster artist I talked about, just before this, plus Hitler, resulted in a lot of powerful messages. Hitler was very good at delivering passionate radio addresses and using that new medium in the 1930s to talk about the German master race and the superiority of German athletes and culture, and of course, to build resentment and hatred towards other races and to Jewish people and Polish people and assorted other groups. Hohlwein's posters presented these strong images of German superiority across the nation. And there's one quote here, what Fry said of Wagner, Wagner is the classical composer who did these masterpiece works in the service of the Third Reich. But the same idea applies to Hohlwein. You can alternate between aesthetic rapture and moral repulsion. And I think it's important to remember and never to minimize as we look at any of this work of the Nazi Party, of the horrific genocide, the horrific and horrifically efficient. It just blows my mind every time we talk or study about this. If you've ever been to the Holocaust Museum in D.C., I recommend it. But the brutality with which they set about this project of exterminating Jewish people and Polish people and, like I said, assorted other groups. So anyway, back to Hohlwein. This is a poster celebrating German girls in sport. It was the Association for German Girls, that's what BDM means, and they had an event called the Reich Sports Day, which is like a sporting festival. It'd be like, the Junior Olympics or something. And Goebbels also said that German sport has only one task: to strengthen the character of the German people, imbuing it with the fighting spirit and steadfast camaraderie necessary in the struggle for its existence. So the Nazification of all aspects of German life, especially extended to sports. They, of course, the connection between creating strong athletes and creating strong soldiers makes sense. And non-Aryan youth, so Jewish or part Jewish or Gypsy athletes, were systematically excluded from German sports facilities and associations and were not allowed to compete. This is another example of other mediums being utilized as propaganda. This was a movie called Judd Sus, which was an anti-Semitic film produced in 1934 with a Jewish antagonist. And so seeding culture not only in obvious government propaganda like posters, but seeding ideas in culture, growing hatred or fear or resentment against a specific group is part of propaganda as well. Leni Riefenstahl is a fascinating figure from the Third Reich. She was Hitler's personal filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, basically. She and Hitler collaborated, and she managed to sort of try to whitewash her image after the war, and actually ended up living to be 100, celebrated her 100th birthday. But she's famous for creating a few different things, but basically two masterpieces of film, one called Triumph of the Will and the other one called Olympiad. And Triumph of the Will is the single most famous piece of Nazi propaganda. It's a exaltation of Adolf Hitler. It focuses on his fans as well as the man himself. And she was hired specifically to cover a particular rally that he spoke at. But she had such an incredible documentary filmmaking vision. She extended that topic to all kinds of other, secondary sources. And it's one of those things, again, it's a masterpiece of filmmaking, but it's a masterpiece of filmmaking for a very evil intent. It's crazy how this is a poster for her movie Olympia, and both movies it really affected the course of cinema history on into the present time. I mean, you'll see specific images of athletes in black and white that have trickled into popular culture from her Olympic movie, and also sort of the way that the Triumph of the Will is filmed, shot, and edited really changed the history of cinema. The Olympia, it was a documentary of the 1936 Olympics. It's a 4-hour feature film, and it was released in 1938. It took her 2 years to edit it. Over 100 different camera people were used in the filming of the events, but she also worked on it long before the 36 Olympics started. She went to Greece and filmed athletes in the nude, like practicing their moves in front of these epic Greek columns. So tying German culture back to the culture of classical Greece and Rome was also part of Hitler's sort of propaganda machinery, in this idea of creating the superiority of the master race. And again, in a little crazy little aside, my father, I know that it's hard to believe that I'm this old, but my dear father was 16 in 1936. He was born in 1919, and he went to the Olympics. He did not compete in them, but I think it was either a boys' club or a Boy Scouts trip. It cost him $200, and they went to Europe I think they departed from New York on the QE2, a big steamship, because that's the only way that you could get there back then. And they toured around a little bit, and then they went to some of the Olympic events. And of course, at the beginning, like I said, that the Americans were not really that aware of what was going on, of who Hitler was. He just seemed like he was a, foreign government official. They didn't really know what he was up to. And hilariously, my father's documentation of the trip, I still have his journal and a bunch of mementos from the trip, and all he wrote down, didn't write down anything about Jesse Owens or Adolf Hitler. He wrote every single meal what they had to eat, which is the kind of family that I come from. We are very food focused. All right, back here stateside, speaking of film propaganda, this is Charlie Chaplin dressed up as Der Fuhrer. He is clearly imitating Hitler, but if you look at this insignia, those are not swastikas. It's a made-up Hollywood version of swastikas. And Charlie Chaplin was very politically aware, and by 1940 at least had figured out what was going on. So he was making a comedic movie to make fun of Hitler. And I think that authoritarians in general do not like to be mocked or made fun of or used for comedy. So I think it was quite a brilliant move on the part of Charlie Chaplin to make people laugh at him. This is from the 1936 Olympics, and this is just, again, a preview of what was about to happen. The war really broke out in 1939, I think, is when they started getting involved. But anyway, 1936, one of the ways that Hitler was showing off the superiority of his troops was to have fully dressed soldiers with all their battle gear on dive from the high diving platform and be like, oh yeah, we have really great athletes, and by the way, look what our soldiers can do. A little bit of intimidation, I want to say. Kind of creepy, knowing what happened next. This is a poster, again, by Hohlwein, our master of the poster arts. It is for the German airline, Lufthansa, that in 1936 was an early passenger airline, and you could fly to the Olympics from other places in Europe. And it's celebrating German victory in the Berlin Olympics and, of course, the triumph of the Nazi movement. So that eagle figure is a Nazi staple. This is a calendar cover from 1938 that, again, is showing this heroic depiction of Aryan blonde German people with a German eagle in the background. And another one of those things that you can appreciate for its aesthetics, but then it gives you the shivers when you think about what those aesthetics were dedicated to. This is a recruiting poster from the early 1940s, a much more intimidating and dark and sort of scary version of this Nazi soldier. So this says, and you? Like, what have you done for me lately? Are you going to join up or what? And we have the red, white, and black German flag in the back. Meanwhile, as the war began to explode in Europe, one of the first moves by the Germans was to invade the Netherlands. And the Netherlands were like, hey, wait a minute. I thought we had this treaty after World War I, and we were like allies, and you were on our side, and we were friends. We were BFFs, right? So how come you just sneakily in the middle of the night crept over and just occupied everything and like killed people? So this is a civilian-made poster, not by a government, but still a very powerful image of this traitorous German soldier who has, again, broken in to their country without permission. So quickly, the Germans occupied the Netherlands. The Dutch population, just much like France later in the war, you get this curious condition where you have the resistance, people that are still anti-German, and then you have the people who were collaborators, who were on the German side, and then you have German propaganda offices moving into the country and creating their own propaganda. So there's kind of a before, during, and after situation with propaganda. So this is during occupied Netherlands, Holland. This was produced, and it looks to me like it's got a very Dutch feeling about it. So I feel like it was produced by a Dutch artist. It does not feel German, but it was produced during the German occupation, and it says the second front. So what this means is a reminder that although soldiers are fighting on the main front, and probably Dutch soldiers were immediately, you could either die or join up with the German occupying army. Those are your choices: resist and die, or hide out, or join up. So the first front is wherever the front was at that time, wherever they were fighting. But the second front was back home, where the Allies were bombing the heck out of everything. So our side was dropping bombs, and that, if you've ever read the Kurt Vonnegut books, I can't remember the name of it. Anyway, Kurt Vonnegut writes about the moral implications of, although the Germans definitely had this genocidal, concentration camp thing going on, we're not completely to blame, because after all, in the end, we did drop the bomb on Japan, drop a nuclear bomb, and in the meantime, we bombed a lot of civilians all over Europe. So this is probably striking fear in the heart of any mother, and trying to whip up a little bit of anti-ally sentiment. This is a reminder from 1939 that the Polish were the first to fight. They were the first place to resist the Nazi occupation. In 1939 was their invasion of Poland, and so this tattered flag saying, we suffered first. This is a poster advertising Italian war bonds. So the fascist side, if you watch Stephen Heller's presentation, you'll recognize that little handle that's coming off of the shovel, which is kind of a weird, like you wouldn't be grabbing that handle down at the bottom, but it's a symbol of the fasce, which is the knife and the bound stick. Anyway, you'll see what I'm talking about when you watch that presentation. But this says those who sow reap. So in other words, if you invest now, you will be able to reap the rewards of your investment if we win the war. Really nice piece of artwork with a stylized man throwing seeds and a gigantic spade. So it's like, if you throw a little money in now, you might get a lot of money back later. This is a depiction. This is from the Japanese side. Now I'm switching over, but Japanese propaganda to depict Churchill and Roosevelt, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, as hungry ghosts. If you had Graphic Design History A with me in the fall, you might remember those scrolls showing hungry ghosts, which are kind of devil figures, and they have this little horned ears, and they're feasting on the bones of Japanese people. Again, the depiction of anybody less than as any particular group of humans as non-human is a typical trope of propaganda, of trying to convince people that we, whoever we are actual people, but they, whoever they are not fully actual full people. Either that or they're evil people. So this is a joyful little combination. This is to promote unity, Pan-Asian unity. So this is saying with the help of Japan, China, and Manchuria, the world can be in peace, trying to ally the Japanese army in World War II with China. Historically, lots of conflict between Japan and mainland China. And China did, of course, end up overtaking and incorporating Manchuria. This is a classic portrayal of a farmer, and the agricultural output of a country is also devoted to wartime usage. So this says "do your duty," I believe, on the left, and it's a heroic Japanese farm woman with a sheaf of wheat, and back in the back you can see a little sort of, I don't know if that's a farm or like a army base or something with a Japanese flag on it. This conveys the message that all jobs are important, that doing your duty is simply doing your own job, whatever it was. So there was the common theme of happiness through work. And you'll see that on all sides because, the whole economy of all of these countries is primarily devoted to the war effort during the time of war. So lots of just everyday items were devoted to war production, whether it's growing crops or making wheels for vehicles. Everything is going towards the war. So here we have the government is way back in the distance, and we have that little sketchy image of Mount Fuji representing, the national identity. And we've got rakes and shovels and machine guns and rifles and paper pushers and everybody. And even a little dog in the middle. Interestingly, in Japanese propaganda, they do not often show Emperor Hirohito because he was considered a deity and his divine presence could not be represented in print. So unlike the Soviet Union glorifying Stalin or Italy and Mussolini or Germany and Hitler, the Japanese glorified a General Tojo. And also a lot of images about the technological superiority of Japan. So definitely, especially at the beginning of the war, they had an air advantage, really advanced war, and also navy, although their navy was relatively small. This is behind this commander guy with his, I forget what that's called, I can't think of the word. Anyway, his little nautical instrument there. And I put this in because this is kind of a foreshadowing of some of the graphic styles we'll talk about next week of constructivism and photo montage and some stuff happening in Russia. So maybe somebody had a little preview of some of that stuff from the 1930s is when that was being produced. So anyway, this is a Japanese poster, again, glorifying the technology. Same here, we've got this amazing graphic image of a propeller on a plane, and in the background some high-rise skyscrapers and gears and a globe and just a lot of advanced tech. This poster I am just crazy about, and it's that kind of conflict of, is it about what it says? I guess it helps if you can't read the words, and I could just look at this as a beautiful object. I love the pattern that's up in the skies of winds. That's like a traditional sort of fabric pattern that's used in Japanese prints. And then we've got all kinds of symbols overlaid on top of each other and incorporated and really unified in this super dramatic composition. So the copy reads, "The Japanese homeland is the center of the world and it stands above all else." And there's just a lot of different symbols of Japanese superiority and of Japaneseness, including, I believe those are like the sort of like zodiac signs all around in the background. I could be wrong about that. But anyway, compositionally, it reminds me of some kind of crazy MTV 1980s, like Shepherd Fairy. I don't know. It's like this mashup of a bunch of great styles. I think it's amazing. And this shows I talked about that conflict between China and Japan. So the heroic fellow on the upper left is Chinese, and the guys down below are Japanese, and they're clearly depicted as being not very nice. And this is a wartime piece. Here also we've got more caricatures. So again, anytime you're showing somebody as being, some particular group of people as being less human or less, less human. We've got Stalin and Churchill shaking hands across a Nazi empire that's in the middle. And above it, we have a scary Jewish stereotype looking down on the scene with the implication that the two below are controlled by some kind of Jewish plot to control Europe. That's the idea, and it was produced in France, so it's French anti-Jewish racism. This is from a collection of very rare window posters from the Soviet Union. They were posted daily in the shop windows of Moscow after the German invasion in 1941. They were intended to rally support for the war and later the post-war effort. And there's all kinds of different art strategies in them by different artists. And I think that the layout is really cool and modern. And we'll talk about constructivism and suprematism again. But we've got all kinds of things from satire to slogans to horror and hatred to patriotic historic parallels and all kinds of other propaganda devices. This is portraying Hitler as a spider in a jar. This is portraying his anxiety as tensions between two of his allies, Romania and Hungary, are fighting inside of the jar. So it's kind of, again, a very intellectualized cartoon, I guess. This also is another one of those posters, and it's just curious how across the distance of time and different culture, we've got this image of a noose in the stars, so in the constellations, and that character down on the top of this castle or whatever it is Hitler. Kind of looking like a little kid. I don't totally get why he has this weird sash on, but anyway, and he's got his nice shaved fade in the back of his head. So anyway, the point of this is that his fate is written in the stars. So, I hope he was scared. And it says, Hitler has retreated to Berchtesgaden to study his horoscope. That is, to divine his fate from the stars. And it says, Hitler divines his fate with trepidation. Underneath there's a poem. To run, but where to? From the east, the west, and the south comes woe. The stars draw on a noose. And that's his answer. There's no salvation from righteous retribution. So that's Hitler. The gods are coming for you. This is another interesting piece of Russian propaganda that is trying to whip up some patriotic fever from residents of the region, the Azerbaijan region, which is I guess that would be northeastern portion of the Soviet Union. So they were worried that this conscripted or forcibly Sovietized area would resist Russia and turn towards the German forces. So the copy reads, "May the memory of your courageous ancestors lead you in this fight," from Stalin in 1943, and portrayed as the heritage of Genghis Khan or the cavalry from the steppes from that territory. We place all our hope in you, Red Warrior, from 1943. It's an atrocity poster from Russia, and it is really doing an effective job of evoking horror and misery. There is a assassin there, a German soldier who is shooting women in and children in a concentration camp. And just a little bit of symbolism there. The birch bark fence that's a very Russian tree. So it's a portrayal of the Russians that were also locked into concentration camps by the Germans. Another topic, another category of propaganda, it was for the people back home and also working in other fields not at the front that were saving resources, to encourage people to save resources or to be productive, to create the supporting means to engage in war. And that includes, this is a Soviet labor poster from 1943 that says something like, the laborer is also a warrior. He's got his newspaper there, and he's some kind of a factory worker. The War Production Board, this is an American poster. He's a fighting fool, give him the best you've got, encouraging people to boost their production at home if they're working at a factory or in another production realm. This is also by the War Production Board, and I can't quite figure this out. I guess free labor means, as opposed to slave labor, that would be, in Germany and in Japan, I guess. Or I'm not sure if it's meant to be anti-communist party, but it's a World War II peace, so the Russians were our partners. Anyway, it's that all-American freedom idea. We've also got another appeal for war bonds. This is 1942, and Americans were really justifiably afraid of a German invasion or German bombing here. Little kids were stationed, along the coast of New Jersey with their binoculars to keep watch at sea and make sure there was no submarines. And there conceivably could have been an air attack, just as there was on the West Coast. Oops. Didn't mean to do that. One of my favorite posters, Can All You Can, which is, again, from the Office of War Information. This is 1943 American. And the idea is, if you have your own victory garden at home and you're conserving your homegrown vegetables for the wintertime, then you're not going to be using up the valuable resources that are going to be sent to the front, to the soldiers in the front. This is a message, similar message from the UK, plan and grow for winter. And I like this little poem, winter fruits from overseas have now to be replaced by these. Kind of awkward grammar, but the idea that we, nowadays we have so become used to being able to have a banana at any time of year, but the shipping and supply lines and just commercial shipping was being interfered with on the high seas. And also, again, things like canned goods were valuable and would have been saved for soldiers. This also explains a little bit of that World War II kind of hoarding mentality that my parents had. A clear plate means a clear conscience. Don't take more than you can eat. So again, saving and being thrifty and conservative in every way at home was a direct translation to everything that you could avoid wasting was a donation to the cause. Right down to the blood in your veins. This is from a famous poster artist, Abram Gaines. This is 1942. Using some very modern techniques here. This might remind you of one of those Cassandra posters, very Art Deco looking. If he should fall, is your blood there to save him? The emergency blood transfusion service needs blood donors. And in fact, that is true nowadays as well. I don't know if you know this, but they need blood and plasma for fighting COVID. So if you have the ability to give blood or plasma, that would be a patriotic thing to do today. This cracks me up. As I said before, propaganda does not only come from the government. So sometimes with a popular cause like the wartime, everybody kind of throws their hat in the ring. Even the Camel cigarette brand, calling itself the Soldier's Steady, which is a sort of strange sexual idea if you think about it. Like, he's going to be off to war without his girlfriend, but he's got a cigarette instead of his girlfriend. Is that how it works? I don't know. Poster to recruit women to join the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service. It was kind of like, again, a backup service for the male troops. And here's a poster just designed to push the patriotic buttons. At the bottom it says, British bombers have carried out over 1,600 raids on Germany up to May 1941. You've got a dynamic air battle scene with Royal Air Force planes and flying through explosions. Again, very Art Deco, very Cubist, post-Cubist. Interesting composition, too. A more patriotic and very typically American appeal, Norman Rockwell did 5 freedoms, I think, or something like that, the 12 freedoms. A bunch of different freedom posters, but this was one of the most famous, ours, to fight for the freedom from want. And it's interesting if you try to like trace, again, the sort of dotted lines between how did the troops fighting in World War II exactly enable this giant turkey to be served back home. And I guess, again, because it was a time of conservation of resources, so the idea that if the war was over, we would all be able to like feast again. And also it is a true threat that during occupied countries, people were starving and eating their, shoe leather and all kinds of things in Europe, atrocities going on, obviously. So the luxury of not being at the front was a very American luxury and freedom. This also, even our dogs getting involved here, this is such a tugging at the heartstrings image. This is 1944, and it's just really like pulling out all the stops. I think this is what I was talking about getting sort of more desperate as the war went on. So this is the star in the background means that this is a home where someone has been lost to war. Some home, the dog's master, whoever that was, maybe a man or a woman. I think that's a Navy neckerchief. So someone has been killed in the war because someone back home gave away a secret. And there was a lot of paranoia during World War II about both Japanese Americans and German Americans, as I mentioned before, being, spies for the other side. So, and I suppose there was a couple cases of actual spies on the American soil. But if with people working in war production jobs, like working at factories or knowing where the troops were deployed to, or if you got a letter from your service person and you figured out where they were stationed, any of those kinds of military secrets could be spilled and, wind up with a casualty, is the point, I guess. Very different approach in England. This is a series of posters for the Labour Party. So this is a political party's poster. And this is a Depression-era message after World War I, before World War II, I believe with a little bit of a bent towards being empathetic to World War I veterans. So the idea being that no one should be landless and no one should be workless, no one should be out of a job or without a place to live in British society. And that's what the promise of the Labour Party was. Even something as happy seeming as this beautiful poster for the London Electric Railway House, encouraging people to travel by rail through England. And so that could be seen as a form of propaganda, not directly related to the war effort. Similar strategy from China, the South Manchuria Railway Company, getting people to travel to the interior of China, maybe to back home traditional lands. And another poster devoted to sort of wartime security. The enemy is on the job every day. Are you? So no days off, no slacking, no dodging your overtime at the factory. Rosie the Riveter, if you're on the job, you should keep on pumping out those tankers, whatever. This is a French poster from the Communist Party of France, and it reads, expensive bread. That's the politics of war. So pomme chère means dear bread. And it's just a very graphic, very modern, again, image. Probably one of the most famous pieces of propaganda from the war is one that was never distributed. This is a rare copy of the original vintage motivational poster that was printed in 1939. The British government printed these, but they never ended up posting them. I think they thought that it was too frightening, maybe, to post. And I think, are attracted to them because there's something just quintessentially British about the language of soldiering on and staying calm no matter what. It seems like a message straight from the Queen. That's her crown there. It was designed by Ernest Walcousins for the Ministry of Information. And that's the symbolic crown of the Tudors. The majority of these posters were destroyed, and then they were rediscovered in the 80s and, made into a meme. I'm sure you've seen all the different variations. There's hundreds of knockoffs of this. Just as in the United States, there was a campaign to encourage women to go into the factories and work. Obviously, they weren't conscripted to work in the factories, but it was still a choice. Although I suppose if you were the only wage earner at your home, if your husband or father had been drafted or killed or missing in the war, you might have been holding ends together all by yourself and making ends meet. So, but the idea of coming to the factories, and what I love, I'm always impressed by is, that the artists that worked on this, it's a fairly straightforward message, but they employed all of the graphic tricks that they know how. There's a little something fiery and ominous in the orange of the sky. All of those planes are sprouting out of that factory behind her and flying off to fight the Germans. She looks very pleased to be going into work. I don't think I felt like that when I worked in a factory. But anyway, the designer really did their darndest. They did their best work, as best good a job as they could. Of course, this should seem familiar to you. This is theoretically the source. It was a photo that was found in the artist J. Howard Miller. We'll look at his famous poster next. This photograph was not this exactly one. When you can see this is from Getty Images, but a photograph from this article about Pretty Naomi Parker. And on the back, the caption was, Pretty Naomi Parker is as easy to look at as overtime pay on the week's check. And she's a good example of an old contention that glamour is what goes into the clothes and not the clothes themselves. Pre-war fashion frills are only a discord in wartime clothing for women. Naomi wears heavy shoes, a black suit, and a turban to keep her hair out of harm's way. We mean the machine, you dope. Mwahaha. And of course, what she was probably the inspiration for is this poster, which was created by J. Howard Miller, who lived in Pittsburgh, yay, PA. It was created for the Westinghouse Electric Corporation that was working in collaboration with the War Production Coordinating Committee. So this is an example of industry and war, that military-industrial complex working together to motivate women to come to work in a factory. And by 1945, nearly 1 out of every 4 married women worked outside of the home, and 65% of the American aircraft industry's total workforce was female. That poster, again, debuted in 1942, but in 1943, there was a big musical hit on the radio, Rosie the Riveter, and this is the cover for the sheet music. I'll play some of it, but there's something true about red, white, and blue about Rosie the Riveter. So the name Rosie the Riveter was popularized after that We Can Do It poster. And then Norman Rockwell took up the theme in 1943. So after that song came out, he used a neighbor who was a petite 19-year-old, and he apologized to her later that he made her look a little bulkier than she actually was. There's pictures of her. We'll see a better picture of her shortly, but She had curly red hair. It's definitely her face. And he had her pose in this heroic position. You can see she's got her name written on her lunchbox. It's underneath her arm. She's eating a nice ham sandwich. There's some kind of femininity about the fact that she has made this sandwich herself and taken it to work. She's got her foot firmly planted on top of Mein Kampf, Hitler's autobiography. That's a riveting machine in her lap. Women did literally use riveters to fasten together the walls of airplanes and tanks and jeeps. She doesn't have a wedding ring on here. You can see she's got all kinds of various pins for blood donation and her security badge and her victory pin. She's wearing overalls, which was a new thing. Women didn't wear pants in public very much before World War II, but during the war it became much more common, and then it stuck around. And she also has that awesome sort of tough punk-ass leather wristband around her wrists, which was part of her equipment for riveting. Good old Norman Rockwell totally stole his pose there, or her pose, from the heroic prophet Isaiah on the roof of the Sistine Chapel. And you can see she even has a little bit of a halo indicated over her head that's kind of made out of the face shield that's up on her head. I love the way now when you look at that prophet Isaiah, it's like, well, where's his ham sandwich? He's ready for it, but he doesn't have it in there. This is a later version of Rosie the Riveter, also by Rockwell, for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post in 1943. This is September of 1943. It's the same model, though, if you notice, the same cute upturned nose on the curly redheaded girl. So this is more like her actual proportions. And she's headed off. She's carrying 31 different props of the 31 different types of jobs that women were doing back home, replacing men that were off to the front. I also relate to this a lot. My mom was Rosie the Riveter. She worked at a piston ring plant in Richmond, Indiana during the war. She was a college student, and during the summer, she went off to the factory and contributed to the war effort. And my mom wore saddle shoes, and I never associated them with the 40s. I thought they were more of like a 50s sock hop kind of fashion, but I think they were a sort of practical work shoes for American girls at that time. A couple more pieces. This is just to show much later impact. This is from the 1980s. It is 1989, and this is a poster to commemorate the bombing of Russia in 1941. So they have their holiday on June 22nd is, I guess, equivalent to our Memorial Day or our Veterans Day. It's commemorating the blitzkrieg of Russia on June 22nd. And this treachery of this attack by a supposed ally was used to motivate Soviet solidarity and is still celebrated. And this is another Soviet poster that just reads, "Remember," and also from 1988 with the Russian star on the back of the wounded veteran's wheelchair. So propaganda can last even past the end of the war and on for another generation to remind people of the atrocities of their enemies and sort of stoke that residual resentment using some of the powerful symbols and powerful emotions that artists can, deliver. I guess my closing remark is just that, graphic design is a superpower, and like any superpower, it can be used for good or for ill. With great power comes great responsibility. So I think it's a pretty clear line when you wonder if you're on the right side. If you're on the side of genocide, of putting people in concentration camps because of their beliefs or their nationality or the color of their skin, you're on the wrong side. So it's a good, clear demarcation of who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And with that, lemon out. See you next week.